of people and we meet a lot of happy people because they're fit and they're getting fitter and they're feeling great. And then we meet a lot of people who are not so happy. And they're not so happy because something happened and they just don't feel right.
Yeah, and just to add to the people that we meet that are happy and fit or getting fit, there's often a story for them to have gotten to that point.
Right. They weren't always happy.
They weren't
people.
always like that.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So in a sense, we help make people happy.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who feel frustrated. And I can tell you this because I was one of them. And I was one of them when I started getting sick and I didn't know what was wrong. And I went to an allergist. I had a horrible cough. And the allergist told me I'm allergic to cats and dust. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I don't really think that's my issue right now. So he said, well, go see a pulmonologist. And he referred me to a pulmonologist who told me I have emphysema. Right. I said, it's really hard for me to accept that because I was riding my bike 25 miles a pop just a few weeks ago. And he said, well, maybe you better go to, and he named a certain institution. Mm-hmm. And I went to the head of neurology and I had tests. And after 3 days of testing, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Now, I'm sitting here telling you I don't have Parkinson's. I had mold toxicity. And I didn't know that. And here's what really struck me and actually led me here. I mean, I was just a personal trainer helping people get great glutes and abs. And it was a career change because I started thinking, how many people have been misdiagnosed with lupus, with MS, with Parkinson's that really don't have it?
Right. And they're diagnosed based on the symptoms. So you have symptoms that may be like a specific disease.
So thankfully, I didn't fully buy into the diagnosis and I started searching. And I'll tell you this, I found a lot of quacks and a lot of charlatans and a lot of people willing to take my money and deliver nothing. Mm-hmm. And then I met some really good doctors. And once I identified what it was, they helped me get well. So I'm so thankful that I stayed on that course and found some great doctors. Well, today we are really privileged to have Dr. Sponaugle joining us from, is it Tarpon? You help me out. I know you're near Tampa. Tarpon Springs?
It's in Osmar. It's between Tampa and Clearwater.
Okay. But you are renowned nationally, if not globally, because you're the guy who gets people well. Is that accurate?
Well, I hate to say it that way, but yes, we've taken probably 50 people out of wheelchairs. Their problem was mold toxicity, inflaming the myelin sheath, and enough mold toxins saturate the myelin sheath. It actually changes the EMF around the axon, and they can become paralyzed.
We are really happy to have you here today, and I'm going to tell everybody this. This is a brief visit, but I'm inviting you back right now to do a full episode for an hour. Right today, we're going to talk about mold remediation, and I have to tell you that was a vital part of my journey because once I understood what was wrong with me living in South Florida, part of the challenge was how do you find a place where there's no mold? So we are going to talk about remediation, but before we do, I thought it would be a good idea for people who have no background in understanding environmental illness to just educate them a little bit. So can you just share with us, when people come to you, I'm guessing you're not their first stop, right?
The average 50-year-old woman has spent $300,000 on cash wellness doctors, an average of 50 doctors. Our record is 211 doctors. A gentleman from New Jersey we took out of a wheelchair in 2013. They've been all over the country and sometimes other countries, and the mold toxicity thing is missed. So,
and at this point, are, let's say, regular doctors, conventional medicine, are they developing awareness or not at all?
You know, it's coming along. I've been diagnosing and treating mold toxicity since 2006. Last count, there were about 2,000 doctors out of 200,000 MDs and DOs who were actually measuring mycotoxins. There's much greater awareness than there was years ago. I used to be a three-headed, heretic when I would talk about mold toxicity, but people are becoming more educated about it.
And when did you first even know about it, think to look at it?
Well, I was chief of anesthesiology of 2 hospitals. And hospitals, by the way, are the worst institutions for mold toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
They never let fresh air come in. But anyway, I was building an integrative medicine practice on the side, and I got moved into an office of a hospital. The practice was growing rather large, and unbeknownst to me, there was black mold hidden behind the wall of the lobby. There was a crack in the outside, about 6 feet long, 2 inches wide, and it rained inside that wall every day it rained. And I was in that office for about 1 month, January, February of 2006, and I suddenly had no energy. You're depressed and raging. Trichothecene, produced by the black molds, our clinical research has proven it blocks the dopamine from the D2 receptor in the reward center. So there's a lot of depression and even suicidality associated with it. But at the same time, we've proven, in 2010, we proved that the trichothecene toxin or gas produced by black molds shuts down the enzyme glutamic acid decarboxylase that converts electrifying glutamate to calming GABA. So it's responsible more than any other chemical for the tripling and now quadrupling of bipolar since 1980. It took about 1980 before we actually decided, based on the oil embargo of 1974, it wasn't really, guys, until about 1980 that everybody replaced the windows and doors with airtight windows and doors. Mm-hmm. So we made all these gas chambers, airtight gas chambers throughout the industrialized world. And it's changed the landscape of medicine. It really has.
You know, when I was a child, pollution was a word. Pollution was something we feared, car exhaust, and you'd see smoke coming out of factories, and we talked about outdoor air being hazardous. Now it's indoor air. Has it kind of reversed?
Yes, it has. Even the feds admit now that 50% of buildings are sick buildings, but it's far more than that. So my patients come from Australia, Canada, America. You can't really, even in Scottsdale, they've got air conditioning fans that run over up above the ceiling tile, and they still get mold above the ceiling tile. And it's the shower tile, if nothing else.
Sure. One
crack in the grout, and the shower hits the crack, and behind the shower tile, all this black mold developing. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
So what were the symptoms that you were developing after about a month in that office?
Fatigue, 4-second memory didn't work as well. You know, our 4-second memory is located in the temples, and it runs off the dopamine D1 receptor, and trichothecene and the ochratoxin gas that's produced by Aspergillus molds. They both shut down tyrosine hydroxylase, the enzyme that converts tyrosine to L-DOPA, which immediately becomes dopamine. So they actually shut down the 4-second memory and your learning processing memory. Furthermore, Japanese research has proven that they destroyed dopamine factories in the 4-second memory, as well as in the caudate nuclei and the substantia nigra Parkinson's region. So, you know, I've given these 4-hour workshops, and you have intelligent women there. I'm saying females because 80% of my patients are females. You know, us men are too stupid to go to a doctor unless someone forces us to, right? We all know that. So I'm giving workshops, and a smart lady would ask me a question, and I couldn't process the question. Mm-hmm. So I asked 3 times, like, well, excuse me, I'm not sure what you said, trying to buy time to process her question. Mm-hmm. I could easily spit out old knowledge from long-term memory and sound very knowledgeable, but I couldn't process the new questions. And I also have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to share with you as you're talking this, my memory now works, thankfully. But I remember when I was going from doctor to doctor and they were going, what are your symptoms? And many of them were bizarre and they would change. But I tried to explain this and I couldn't explain it well. I said, I can't prioritize. And they go, what do you mean? I'd say, well, like I get to where I'm going in my car, and I'm trying to think of the order. Like, when do I take off my seatbelt? When do I turn off the... And that sounds bizarre, but I just knew something in my brain isn't working. Are you surprised by that or not?
Not in the least. I've got PET scan research that no one has. Treating some NFL players for brain trauma, they got me an incredible deal on PET scans. So we have a large database. And prior to having the PET scans, from 2013 on, I would use SPECT scans. But once I got to PET scans, when you measure the toxin levels, and you're measuring mycotoxins and petroleum-based toxins, petroleum-based toxins will reveal a global shutdown globally throughout the cortex. But we learned that the trichothecenes will actually shut down the cerebellum first. To rephrase it in a better method, the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum are much more sensitive to mitochondrial shutdown from trichothecene. And the cerebellum plays a large role in prioritization as much as the prefrontal cortex, which they work together. There's actually a tract from the PFC to the cerebellum. So what you'll see in my practice are all these patients who should have more activity in their cerebellum than any other brain region, yet their cerebellum is typically the most suppressed region. And then the judgment and organizational thoughts come from the medial frontal lobe. Pretty much a majority of the prefrontal cortex is dopamine driven. And so between those two regions being downregulated in electrical activity, you take 5 hours to prioritize packing your suitcase for a 1-day overnight deal. You know, it's very common what you experienced.
What do you see in terms of, you said people have been to 20 doctors, 30 doctors, 50 doctors, and then they find you. What do you see in terms of misdiagnosis? What do they come to you thinking they have, other than depression?
Well, you didn't name the institution earlier.
Correct.
What I have found is the bigger the name of the institution, the dumber they are.
It's a big one.
And most of my
I'm going to
patients
use that.
have been,
I like it.
you know, it's the truth. If you come into my clinic, there are 50 people here. Usually there's 40 females, 10 males. And we've had up to 80, but I've tried to ratchet it down some. Look, if you mention certain institutions that are household names, they will start grinding their teeth. Mm-hmm. What they got, and it's an excellent question, they got a diagnosis after seeing 6 specialists at the top universities in the country of needing psychological help. They're frequently diagnosed bipolar. Females have no chance because they will, in their idiocy, always blame it on the hormones. And I actually wrote a book on how female hormonal imbalance can cause a lot of issues like depression and anxiety, but that's not the case because in females, it's that. They always get sent to 2 places after going to multiple professors, the psychiatry division and the pain clinic. And I've seen multiple marriages ruined by top name psychiatrists who convinced the husband and the adult children that the mother's schizoid and bipolar. And once we were able to ascertain through our own clinical research that certain mycotoxins are preventing the conversion of electrifying glutamate to GABA, you have a majority of brain regions that are over-electrified, giving you panic disorder and bipolar. And actually, once an electrical organ like the brain is over-electrified enough, you develop paranoia. But the dopaminergic regions, the nucleus accumbens, the reward center, and the motor braking regions are actually underactive. So you can see how you get an increase of bipolar by the patient being both depressed and over-electrified and jacked up, ready to ram a car if it pulls out in front of them. So it's through researching on a biochemical level. And how do we prove this without spending thousands of tax dollars? It's very simple. Measure the toxin levels, measure the neurotransmitters, of which I've done close to 14,000, right before and right after you remove those toxins from the bloodstream, and you can bring people out of a suicidal depression in about 5 minutes and bring them out of a bipolar state in about 5 minutes. It doesn't take but 2 or 3 circulation times. And it's sad that, and take this home, the folks that are listening, more than anything else, when I speak, and I love speaking to naturopaths and integrative MDs, and one of my favorite meetings is the Integrative Medical Mental Health meeting. I've spoken in San Diego, LA several times, and I get an hour slot, and they usually stay 4 hours, but they want to learn. And I've been saying since 2007, oh my God, our colleagues, are blocking the wrong brain chemical. There's been an assumption, guys, that everyone who acts bipolar has excessive dopamine. All the bipolar drugs sit on the dopamine receptors and block dopamine from activating the nerve receptor. Well, guess what? 90% of them have normal dopamine levels. Their excess voltage and their behavior is caused by an imbalance in the ratio of glutamate GABA. So when you block the dopamine with the antipsychotic or bipolar drugs, it causes suicidal depression. Is it not a sad thing, and you should teach everyone you know, that as of 2 years ago, the number one cause of death in American kids aged 15 to 24 was no longer car accidents. It is now physicians prescribing dopamine blocking drugs to these kids who are mold toxic, and they become suicidal and kill themselves.
I want to ask you a couple of quick questions, and then I'm going to apologize for cutting this short, but I really look forward to having you back because as we're talking, there's a lot of kind of roads that we can head down. But I mentioned MS and lupus and Parkinson's. And, a lot of people call me because they know my story, and they say, what should I do? I have all of these symptoms, and I think I have mold. And the first thing I say is get away from the mold. That's the very first thing you have to do is get away from the mold. And they'll say, well, no, I have somebody coming, and they're going to look at it, and they're going to fix it, and they sprayed some bleach, and there's resistance. Even if I refer them to a doctor, and I can tell you, if I'm referring them to you, and you'll get a lot of people coming from me, many of them won't go until it becomes so severe that they're so broken that they have no option. Do you run into that level of resistance where people go, nah, I can just deal with it? Because I think the extreme levels are preventable if you catch it in time.
Absolutely. You're 100% on target. I could have had 10 books written. The time I've wasted convincing husbands who aren't home, their national sales director traveling, their wife and kids are dying from hidden black mold or whatever. Look, the biggest problem is that the black molds don't smell, and they're hidden behind walls, under windows, etc. Men, I teach that we have half the brain as females. It's a known fact. I won't get into why because we'll run out of time tonight. But look, men are stubborn. They don't want to spend the money. The biggest problem is that the mold inspectors who are ill-knowledgeable will come in and do an ERMI test. They'll suck mold spores into a tube and send it off to be measured. And they'll come back and say, well, you have no mold in your house. Well, there's no mold spores floating throughout the room. Mm-hmm. However, there may be massive black mold infestation hidden behind a wall, behind the shower tile, et cetera, et cetera. So the mold inspectors, first of all, if they come into your home without infrared camera, so they can see moisture behind a wall, you throw them out on their head in about 2 minutes. And you have to convince people. They just don't know because physicians don't know. I could sit here and list 25 cancers that are caused by these toxins, and that takes another time and more effort. But I said in 2008 that these mold toxins, being lipophilic and fatty, are the number one cause of the rise of MS in American women. But I got so many nasty emails from neurologists from California to Boston, I became a coward and took my page down. But Japanese scientists vindicated me 4 years later, University of Nippon, and they proved that the mold toxins are causing MS. My theory, which has been validated, is simple. If you have lipophilic, fatty in molecular structure toxins floating around your bloodstream. They're going to circulate for a short time before they migrate to and deposit in the fattiest tissue in the body. Well, the myelin sheath on our sciatic nerve or brain nerves is 80% fatty content. It's simple biochemistry. The bad fatty toxins move into a fatty acid chain where there should be healthy fatty acids. So they inflame the myelin sheath and they end up causing MS. And MS is massively on the rise. What I can't tell you is why men with the same toxin exposure get more Parkinsonian symptoms and women get more MS. I have some theories, but I won't espouse them yet. It's a disaster for the brain, the pancreas, the liver. The trichothecene toxin is 10 times more liver toxic than alcohol. Wrap your brain around that. And once it shuts down the cytochrome P450 enzymes, the patient can't detox all the GMO toxins and all the petrotoxins in the water and the lakes, which come through the skin. The autistic kids I treat, they all had mold toxicity and no liver detox. Ochre toxin shuts down the liver or the kidneys. So the patient then is rendered what patients have taught me through thousands. Then they can't detox the petrochemicals they're exposed to. And the sicker they get, the more hot baths they take, trying to get the toxins out. But that water's coming out of the Great Lakes or river basins. Companies are dumping petrochemicals more than ever. They've determined that it's cheaper to pay the fine every 5 years than to pay to have a toxin taken away. So the shutdown of the detox pathways and the mycotoxins then secondarily or subsequently causes an overload of the petro-based toxins and pesticides. And it's just a downward spiral. And everything from pancreatitis to liver failure. But, you know, my love is the brain. And I can go on for hours. I won't do it. But I can explain what region is being shut down and why people develop resting tremors and Parkinsonian symptoms, et cetera. We've got so much research. It's not in rats like the university people. It's not paid for by tax dollars. You know, my rats look like this beautiful lady and me and you. And it's clinical research, which has much more value than unilateral thinking and vertical thinking in a rat lab. But
I want to share just a couple of quick thoughts, and then, as I said, I really look forward to having you back, and we're going to post your information right now on the screen for anybody who wants to reach out to you. But, you know, I'm listening to you, and you're talking about a mold inspector doing an Army test. I had a 4,500 square foot building, and the roof was blown off after Hurricane Wilma. I mean, literally, the whole roof was gone. The building was flooded, and not being bright enough to understand the risks, I was in that building every day, paying contractors to rip out rotting drywall and carpet. And then the landlord fixed everything and made it look beautiful. And the office was better than it ever looked at. A personal training studio, a conference room, a theater. It was beautiful. Warehouse space. And then I started getting really sick, and nobody else in the office was, which was strange because I kept kind of wondering, is it me? It feels like this happens to me when I'm in the office. So I told the landlord, they sent an inspector. He climbed up on a ladder. He waved a little petri dish. And then I got a call the next day. No mold. I finally hired a guy who was supposed to be the top mold expert. And he came in and he tore away the baseboard. That was the first thing he did. And he took pictures. And then he told me they never changed out the air ducts. Everything was brand new, but they had all the original air ducts in the AC system. And he wrote me a letter saying, never walk in that building again. So, you know, when you talk about the mold test, that mold test passed. When the guy came in and tested, I didn't know that he wasn't an adequate tester. I believed, hey, there's no mold. It must be something else. So we're about to speak with Kevin Sutherland, who is a mold remediator. So, Kristin, here's what we know at this point. Mold is a serious problem. It is. I've lived it, you know, and it's difficult because I will tell you that during my odyssey, I sounded crazy. I mean, I would say things that sounded crazy because the symptoms weren't reasonable and the diagnoses weren't reasonable and the doctors didn't know what to do. So they passed me off to somebody else with a diagnosis and a prescription. But the diagnosis is the first moment of relief where you go, at least I know what's wrong. Then you need the treatment, which will get you well. But if you go right back into a moldy home, the whole process starts all over again. So that's why
I think here in South Florida, the problem is even bigger than we know. This is an issue for so many people.
Well, I'll tell you that when I first started understanding what was wrong and I hired people to remediate mold issues, again, I ran into charlatans and scams, and there's a lot of money to be made. When there's a massive problem like mold in South Florida, you better bet that people are going to show up who are going to take your money, whether or not they deliver a result. So I've been through a lot of mold remediation people, and I've been disappointed. I've been angry. And then one day I said, you know what? I just moved into a new home. It wasn't a brand new home, but I just moved into a home, and there was some water. And I said, I'm going right to the top. I went to Angie's List, and I just chose the number one guy. And that's the day that I met Kevin Sutherland. And I will tell you that immediately I knew this guy was different. So if we're talking about mold, we got to bring Kevin on. So, Kevin, I'm really glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of different situations. Handled problems for a lot of different properties. Each one seems to have a little different twist to it, but you just gotta dissect it, figure out.
Yeah, Brennan, stick your hand in there and fix the mic. Seriously.
Yeah, what's up? Bringing you a little bit closer, just like that.
Well, you gotta dissect it, figure out what the issue is, what's causing it, and properly remediate it, at the same time protecting the other areas of the house.
So let me ask you this. What education do you have? Because if you're screening mold fixers, what's the first thing you look for? Like, what should I have known to look for so I would have skipped, all the guys who ripped me off?
Right. Well, now in Florida, they have licensing. So you definitely want to make sure they're licensed. But back in the day, it was just certification. So the IICRC was the main one nationally, and that's where I got certified. And I did my continuing education. But you basically just need to look at reviews because they do teach you a lot of important information in the books, but experience is really where you gather the most knowledge.
There is a company in South Florida, and they have trucks. And on the truck, it says, "We show up." And it's sort of a joke, but it's not. Because when you are in a need of repair, it's frequent that people don't show up, right? I mean, you've probably been there yourself where there's like a window. They go, we'll send our guy between 3 and 6. And like 6:05, you're calling and you're getting, dial 1, dial 2. Sure. So, we show up gives you an advantage, which is absurd. But I'm curious, did you set out to be better than everybody else?
Well, it's just my nature. I want to do things right. I like to help people, and then, there's no tension on me. I know I did the best I can. I sleep better at night that way. The client does too. And, it's just a win-win all the way around. So
when somebody is suffering some of the symptoms and they suspect they have mold, what's the first thing they should do?
First thing they should do is get an inspector out there, assessor, they're going to properly diagnose the home, whether it has a problem or not. There are a lot of, like you said, untrained people out there, though. That's the misfortunate part. So you want to find somebody with experience. Once again, you got to read the reviews. It's kind of like how we were talking about doctors. You go to one, they really don't have the answer, but they feel like they need to say something, so they tell you something. But it's hard, it's tricky to find one that you could really trust and know that's doing the right job. So
Dr. Sponaugle made 2 comments that I want to talk about. And one is he said, sometimes you'll get an inspector comes out, just does an ERMI test and tells you there's no mold.
Yeah. That's misfortunate. Did they check all the areas? Did they do it correctly? Did they have the right comparison, the right core sample outside? I guess they get a lot of people do it by swabs and tape lifts, but to really know an abnormal situation needs to be an air sample. And I think you had this problem at your house. you had stuff inside the wall, but it might not be coming into the common air on some days.
Right.
Maybe you have a low pressure outside, but when that changes to a high pressure, air will push into the soffit vents, push it through the attic, into the wall cavities, and it could change your reading from an inside sample.
So just by taking an air sample one day, that may not be representative of what's going on.
Right.
Every single
day.
day.
It could alter. It could alter. If it's a large colonization that is on the interior side of the drywall, the probability is high that you pick it up, in any sample. But if it's inside the cavity, you may some days and may not.
So why would some inspection groups not do it the right way? Is it lack of knowledge, or are they trying to cut corners, cut costs? What's going on?
It could be a little bit of everything there. A lot of people, switch companies very often, so they just get people fresh out of the school. They don't have the correct experience. Sometimes it's the cost of the samples. Sometimes it relates back to the client just not really wanting all the samples, or paying the costs for the lab fees to endure all
to
the
do
samples.
an appropriate test.
Correct.
Now, Dr. Sponaugle also said if your mold inspector comes and doesn't have a moisture detector, kick him out.
Yeah. Moisture meter is very important, but that doesn't necessarily mean you will find moisture when there's mold, because mold grows from moisture. That starts the colonization, whether it's humidity or direct water source like a leak. But if that dries up, the mold is still going to be there. And actually, when it dries, it actually goes airborne more. If you think of a pile of, dust or something, baking soda, flour, when it's dry, it just, goes up in the air if you blow on it. If it's wet, it stays together like a cake. So it could be more dangerous in the dry state.
So how does somebody know, if they should get tested? If they see visible mold in the shower, if you're seeing mold, is that a problem?
To a degree, everybody's body takes it differently. Some people are more susceptible than others. The showers, the grout is very common. Florida, down here, everywhere we get mold. And the grout in the shower is really somewhat minimal, unless you're one of those people who are highly susceptible to it.
Okay.
But now they're coming out with products, grouts and caulkings and silicone sealants that resist the mold growth. And so advancements in the materials of construction are really helping.
And so of the homes that you go into, how common, at the point that you're getting called in, how many, 9 out of 10 homes test positive, or is it half and half, or what would you say?
Yeah, I would say maybe 8 out of 10. 80% is a good representable number.
Okay.
Usually when I'm called in, it's because something, they suspect something.
Right.
A lot of times when it wasn't a positive test, I kind of notice just from the experience I was talking about, it's a VOC, a volatile organic compound, which is a gas that's released. It, could be formaldehyde, or it's released from some different type of products, cleaning products, car ignitions.
Carpet.
Yeah, carpets.
Furniture.
Carpets release some furniture, sure, the wood furniture.
Pressed wood cabinets.
There was a lot of
so
them
you mean
in the
they're getting sick
linoleum
from
and vinyl.
something else, not from mold?
Yeah, well, that's what I don't necessarily saying they're getting sick from it. They could,
Right.
Sure, just if they're susceptible to it, but just the odor set them off, and they thought that
It
it's
was
mold,
mold.
so they got it checked out, and
Sure.
it turns out not to be mold. And a lot of times I'll try to save them the cost. I'll tell them, you could take this test, but I'm not sure if you're going down the wrong path, because from my experience, I think you're smelling a VOC instead of the mold. And usually I'm right about that. So.
Sure.
What's one of the worst cases you've seen?
Oh, well, I mean, there's several different worst cases. I guess the worst of them all is just because of the size, but because it was a large condo building, they had a little fire, it was up high, but when the firefighters were there spraying the hose, all that water ran through. It was all the way down through the hallways and everything, so it's just mold throughout. And I guess the reason
So that
why
was a secondary, after the fire, the mold problem.
Yeah, well, it was primary and secondary. Primaries with the direct water source, so all that water runs down, and where that water was soaked into the walls, that grew mold. But then it also elevated the humidity levels, so all those humidity levels started growing surface mold everywhere.
So is that fixable, or is it just like, get out of the building, we're going to knock it down?
For the majority part under that tower, not the whole building on the other side, very large building. But it's pretty much all got to be gutted. They shouldn't be in that area. I didn't do the remediation project because I was the assessor for that. But then, that was probably the worst case I've seen because of the amount of people affected by it, because it was so many different properties, condos, one on top of the other.
Yeah, you said something important. If you're the assessor, you shouldn't be the remediator. Is that true?
Right. As far as
because you'd have an agenda, obviously, right?
Yeah, you want it not biased on the clearest.
Right.
So, but when I do my remediation projects, I do test them after. I don't consider that the clearance. If the client could go out and pull everybody, I say you could have anybody you want test. Let me just make sure it's right for my own liability purposes, and I feel better also when I do that, because then I know. It's going to pass when they have their third party come in, and they won't get charged twice. Like he comes, it's not passing, and then he has to come back again, and they get a double bill. So.
Kevin, Dr. Sponaugle was talking about how it affects neurotransmission and how it makes people behave in a way that replicates bipolar, where they may appear depressed and they also may suddenly get angry.
Okay.
Do you run into what appear to be crazy people who have mold issues?
Well, I run into a lot of people that appear to be crazy, but I'm really not with them that long, I guess, to see.
But let's be honest, aren't there times that somebody calls you and they seem panicky and overboard and they're insisting because it's like this invisible thing? But often they're right, and the unfortunate part is the mold is making them sick. Right. I've met a lot of people who have needed medical treatment.
Sure.
And I wondered, are they sick people who got crazy or crazy people who got sick? And I think the great majority of them are sick people who got crazy because they can't find a solution and the enemy is invisible, so nobody else can see it,
Well, I know it does affect a lot. I talked to some of the people who, when we're trained, we know that, well, obviously it's breathed in through the nose, it gets into the lungs, it dissolves, and whatever chemicals that species has, toxins, it's released, absorbed into the body. And then I do know it does make its way to the bloodstream, because a lot of my clients say that they had their blood tested and the doctor found mold inside the blood. And that's the reason why they're having their home tested. And sure enough, it turns out to be infected. So then we got to go around and find the area and then put together a protocol for that. But it does affect the body. You're right, it is the hidden bad guy out there, and I'm sure it can affect the brain.
Yeah.
So for the general listeners watching this right now, I mean, what would you recommend? Is this the type of thing that everyone should just go out and test their house, or do they wait till they have symptoms? I mean, when do you know is the right time to test or check?
Yeah. Well, I guess always having a test is a good thing. But if it needs a water source, but a lot of times people get elevated humidity in Florida, so they get the surface mold and they don't think they could have mold because they didn't have a water source that would make the mold. Mm-hmm. But it's just feeding off humidity. And that's usually worse in some cases, because when that happens, it's more spread out throughout the property, instead of being located to, isolated to just one area where the leak was. Even though spores transfer from there, but I'm saying just the higher numbers consistent throughout the property.
So certainly people who have had leaks or damage or hurricane issues.
Or odors, if you have odors, if you sense, I guess the biggest thing is to try to compare how you feel indoors, and then when you leave the property, you're outside for a while on the weekend or at work on the weekday. Do you feel better? Right. And then do you notice the symptoms when you come back and you sleep in the home for 8 hours? A lot of times you'll wake up, I get reports from clients that they when they sleep, I guess they're in that area for so long, 8 hours, and then they wake up with itchy eyes, scratchy throat, congested. Then they leave and they're good. So that's usually a clear indicator that something's going on inside the property. So good time to test.
Mm-hmm.
If we really think about everything that was spoken about just so far in our conversation, Dr. Sponaugle mentioned autism, MS, bipolar. It's sort of ironic and bizarre that so many of these manifestations of diseases may simply be a reaction to mold. So, at what point, and you can't answer this, Kevin, but I'm just thinking, like, at what point does somebody whose child develops symptoms or is having trouble concentrating in school, or when their memory is suddenly flawed, at what point do they suspect, maybe I better have my home checked for mold? So in those cases, what is somebody going to spend to get their home checked for mold? I think a big reason not to is the cost.
Sure. Well, a basic cost is going to start up around $300. But it all depends upon the size of the property, the square footage. But typically, it ranges between $300 to $1,000. And then the higher end there, it would involve a protocol should something be found.
And when something is found, you can break it down to the different strains, correct? There are some molds that are not as threatening as others.
Sure. With the test, when they're coming back from the lab, it'll identify the different species and also the concentration.
Can you talk about a case where you had a major issue and you actually remediated it and fixed it?
Yeah, well, it happens all the time. We go into whatever property. Sometimes they know about it, sometimes they don't. If they do know about it, we skip the testing. I tell them, I'm honest with them, it's a waste of money. It's coming up positive. Let's do this. You could pay to have it tested later. Right. So we go in there, remediate. If it's a kitchen, wherever it is. But it's very important to have a containment. You got to do it right. You have to have a tight containment with a negative pressure, air scrubber inside. We like a dehumidifier in there to help regulate the relative humidity, keeping that low.
I got to stop you because this is really important. Some people, and Dr. Sponaugle actually mentioned this too. Sponaugle.
Tomato.
Yeah. Dr. Sponaugle also said that the worst thing you could do is just spray bleach.
Yes.
Because it opens up the
sure. Well, bleach is known to create myotoxins. And, myotoxins could, I understand it could lead to brain tumors and other bad things for the body. But, yeah, bleach is wrong. I think that's a myth on the internet. A lot of people pick it up and they do that, which is very unfortunate. But you should get an antimicrobial if you want to, fight mold.
So, Kristin, when Kevin came into my home to do the work, to remediate it, he didn't come in alone. He came in with guys. And all of a sudden they're putting up stuff and they're building a containment and they put in these huge noisy machines that are sucking air and creating negative energy. And I think of the people who'd come in the past and they just were blowing mold all over the house, right? By not creating that containment because you're stirring it up.
Sure. So, and it gets worse before it gets better. Inside that containment is, when you first build it, it's not good because you have the mold colonization there. But when you start to disturb those building materials, you take off the baseboard, poof, in the air, microscopic, you can't see it. Mm-hmm. Right, tear up that drywall, the insulation. When you get in that insulation, some of it's fiberglass or the cellulose. You also have those fibers going into the air. But, we're there tackling mold, but we don't want any fiber or mold or fiberglass to be flying around where people can breathe it. So it's very important to have a good containment. So
you're sectioning off an area of the house so you know that you have the mold contained.
That's right.
Explain what you mean by negative pressure.
Negative pressure is inside the containment. There's a positive pressure outside, so you will see a bow in the plastic because the high pressure is pushing inside. So what's happening is the air is leaving out of the containment zone. Usually we have a duct out through a window or somewhere, a door, but it's leaving outside of that containment zone faster than air is coming in. So this, if it was vice versa, then air from the containment zone could be going into the living space, which is defeating our purpose. So we don't want a positive pressure inside. We want to keep it negative, keep air going out and not coming, or not vice versa.
Okay, so now what's really cool is you've got options. Like once you find mold, it's not just one fix. You have options depending on the circumstance, right? So I know one of the things that you've done with me is ozone.
Yeah, well, we like ozone. Ozone is O3, which flying around us. We have O2, 2 molecules of oxygen, and then we have O1. That's what we breathe. O1 and O2 is what we breathe. It's absorbed by the body. O3, you don't want to be in it when you're ozoning so much, at least not at the levels that we use for the remediation, because your body does not absorb it. And
did you tell me you once went back in the house, you forgot something and it affected you, your throat?
Yeah, it affects me sometimes in high level, but I know
because you wear a mask when you do this, right? You wear a
right. I usually do it when I do an antimicrobial fog, and so I'm masked up.
Right.
But it's labeled as a respiratory irritant, and if it's real light, one of these little things that people have, you're okay because you still have enough O2 and O1 going around where you can breathe. But with the machine I have, it's converting a lot of it to O3, so it almost feels like you're suffocating because your body can't absorb it. But anyway, oxygen is a very unstable molecule, and so when you have 3 together, it can attack those microorganisms, and fungi being one.
Yeah. Well, you're a fun guy.
Yeah, thank you.
Kristin, don't we also use ozone as a treatment intravenously?
We do. We use ozone in the clinic. I love it for sinuses. I'll use it kind of up the nose. Okay. But you can use it in different diseases. It's used in Crohn's as kind of a rectal insertion. There's a lot of different applications. You can do it as an IV. Ozone's great.
Okay, yeah. That's news to me. I learned something. Great.
You learned rectal insertion today. Today's the day Kevin learned rectal insertion. Some other treatments are, you mentioned the antimicrobial, the fog.
Yeah, I like this because it's basically, it's the same. I like to use them in conjunction, but they're doing the same purpose. But one is the chemical and one is nature's way. O3 is natural. It's formed in the world by lightning bolts.
And actually, there's a smell that's kind of like a rainforesty smell after the ozone.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of people do like that. I like it a little bit too.
So the chemical way.
Yeah. Well, the chemical is just antimicrobial that we fog, but we like to use it in conjunction with ozone, as I was saying. It's good to get into porous materials, but also we could pass it through the ductwork, through the AC coils. It gets into that, if you're doing a surface mold remediation, you clean as well as you can throughout the property, the knickknacks, the furniture, the clothing. But, there's always a percentage that you just can't get to for whatever reason, a nook down in the crevice. But this can get everywhere, so that's why I like to use it.
Now, the coolest, newest thing is this particle smasher, right? That's not what you called it. That's what I'm calling it. And Kristin, you use a filter for the clean room in the lab, so I think you guys can speak common language here. But explain what this does.
Well, her filter is probably a HEPA. Gets down to like 0.03 micron.
Yep.
And well, the average mold spores run in between 3 to 5 microns, which is very small. If you had a tip of a human hair, you can't use mine, but you could put like 200 mold spores on the very tip. So just to give you how small. But this new product is labeled as a non-mechanical air scrubber. It basically pulverizes microscopic particles, and the way we can verify that is we use a particle counter. A laser particle counter will go ahead and take the readings 5 different readings ranging from 6 different ones. Well, it depends on which particle you count or have, but ranging from 10 microns down to the 0.3 microns. We can, note which those numbers are, go ahead and administer the product, and then go ahead and take the numbers again, and you can see the drop. And I'm still testing, it's a new thing out on the market, so I'm still experimenting with it. Some of my experiments I've done with the standard mold testing that we've been doing for years, to do them side by side. They go to different labs, get the reports back, and compare them. And so far, it's showing promising. So I'm happy to have it on the market.
I'm curious, do you get a chance to remediate or inspect schools?
Yeah, I've inspected and remediated schools. So
I would guess that most schools have some mold issue.
Oh yeah.
And you have to wonder how that impacts learning.
Behavior.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah, that's a good point. But unfortunately, there's nothing special about that building. Acceptable to the humidity, the leaks, the plumbing leaks, the roof leaks, even kids just spilling a bottle of water in the corner there, and then they pick up the bottle, all the water absorbs into the wall. It's never cleaned up and dried. Yeah, so I'm sure that happens all the time too.
So here's the good news for you. There's no shortage of business. You're in South Florida.
Yes.
If you move to Arizona, it might be a different story, but as long as you're here.
Yes, the state flower is mold.
Yeah. And as long as you stay committed to excellence, I'm not worried about you. The question is, do you want any more business? Because we can put your contact information right here.
Yeah, absolutely. Put it up there.
Do you have any time for more?
Sure. Fire away.
Okay. All right. Here it is. All right. So, Kristin, this is a topic that we can't just leave with this podcast. I mean, it's affected me. It's affected a lot of people, but more importantly, it's affecting a lot of people who have no idea.
Yeah, I can bet that there are people watching it right now that are thinking, wait a minute, this is starting to make sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Why am I developing the sinus issue and geting migraines? And come to think of it, there is a little bit of a funky smell downstairs, or there was a little bit of a leak in the sink. So I think what you have to do is call somebody competent to come check it out. Kevin, what should people know? As we wrap this up, what do you want them to know so that they don't get taken, they don't get ripped off? And before you answer that, I'm coming back to this idea of money. The testing costs money, but the remediation costs a lot because sometimes you got to tear out walls and tear out a room. In most cases, do homeowners insurance pay for it?
That depends. A lot of times with the surface mold cases, I find that the policies do not cover it. With the primary cases where it was direct water source, if it wasn't something from neglect, a maintenance thing that should have been done, like caulking around sealing around a window every few years or something. But if it was a plumbing leak inside the wall that you just had no control over, then that's usually accepted in a claim.
So you deal directly with the insurance companies in those cases?
I can, but as of July 1st, 2019, a law went in effect from what the legislation signed back in February 2019, which is taking away some of the rights for the AOB form, which allows us to deal with the insurance company. So,
what's the AOB?
It's an assignment of benefits. So if you had a policy but you didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to call, set up a claim, then you would sign that, and then it would allow, whatever company you're dealing with, doesn't necessarily have to be a remediator, a plumber, GC, whatever. It doesn't even have to be a mold remediation project. But if you're dealing with another contractor and you don't want to set the claim, they give you an AOB form, and then that makes it mandatory where the insurance company had to talk to you. But things are changing a little bit about that as we speak.
Okay. So coming back to my question as we close it out today, I've been through the rip-offs and the wrong guys, and I've seen the other side of the coin here. And I'm thankful that I found you because you're, incredibly responsive. B, you're so committed to getting the job done, and that's rare. You don't just like do a thing and leave. Like you're coming back the next day to test, and if it's not clean, you're going to run the ozone. You don't see that a lot, honestly, in South Florida, especially in this field. So what can you say to people so they don't make the mistakes?
You got to do your research. There are a lot of companies out there, and Florida is the habitat for mold, so more and more are being incorporated every day. There's a lot of bait and switch companies out there, who'll lowball you if you're taking bids, and then in the middle of the project, all of a sudden switch or just stop until you pay them more for whatever reason. So, you got to really research your companies, read the reviews, check Better Business Bureau. Very important to make sure that they are licensed. Go to the Florida website.
How'd you get to be at the top of Angie's List? Do you pay for that?
No, I don't pay for Angie's List. Yeah,
that's organic.
I just do a great job at what I do. So
yeah, because I know a lot of the social media companies that rate places can charge you money and you get a higher rating, but that's not what you do, right?
That's right. I don't pay for any of those lead services.
All right, Kristen, from now on, you know my 5% rule, right?
Right.
That 5% of the people are what?
Not friendly.
I used a different word that started with the letter A, but because, sometimes the 5% seems like 90%, but it's really only 5%. Mm-hmm. I think from now on, we're going to say to those 5%, have you had your home mold tested?
Yeah.
I think that's the thing
mold
to do.
May cause
maybe, yeah.
Not friendly.
Yeah, that may be the problem. All right, so listen, we've made another little dent in rescuing people and helping them save their own lives and get well and be their best. But again, Kristen, we've got a lot of work to do. Yes?
Yes, we do. Let's get the word out.
All right. More to come. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Kevin.
Bye.
You got it. Thanks, guys.